All right. So we have the three different types here. I'm going to show you those sort of together here so you can see them up there, hopefully. The different grits. You're going to notice how they look a little bit different. The one there on your right is 400 grit. That's this one here. It looks the smoothest and it's going to feel the smoothest. Now between these two, it's a little harder to tell the two apart, but you can definitely tell them apart when you feel them. This one is much rougher. This one here is 150 grit. This one here is 220 grit. Okay? So we're going to set those two aside. Now when we go to use these, we're going to have small pieces like this. You're going to get a little square like this to sand with. All right? Now one thing that I want to get a little bit into the grits, just a little bit more. The 150, 220, and 400. There is a system there. Okay? The higher the number, the finer or smoother the emery paper is. The lower the number, the coarser or rougher the emery paper is. So 80 grit is coarser than 100 grit. It's rougher than 100 grit. And so on and so forth. So as the grits move up in number, it actually starts to get finer. It actually refers to how many particles there are per square inch. So 150 is basically 150 million particles per square inch. 220 million particles per square inch. 400 million particles per square inch. So if we can fit 400 million particles per square inch, basically this is about per square inch right here, this little piece. If we can fit 400, they got to be smaller. So the higher the number, the smaller the grit, which means the finer the grit. Okay? All right. So here's my project right here. This is the piece that I'm going to start sanding. First, what I'm going to do, when I take this out, I'm going to figure out where I want it to hang from. And then I'm going to punch a hole. Now, what I typically do with you guys is I'm going to mark this for you. I'm going to mark this for you. And I want it to hang from the top up here. And I don't have a lot of room, so I got to make sure I'm pretty close to this top layer. So I'm going to make a little mark there. And then I'm going to punch a hole. This is where it's going to hang from. I'm going to try to do this prior to sanding. If I don't, what ends up happening is I get a lot of scratches on the back here after I've already sanded. Now I'm ready to sand. Okay? All right. So what I have here is I have the 220 first. I'm going to fold this in half like this. I'm going to hold this down. And I'm going to sand back and forth in one direction. Back and forth, right on the top. And you're going to start to see very quickly that this is going to sand smooth. Smoother anyway. It's going to start getting brighter. All right. So I've sanded that one side. This other side's still dark. I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to do the same thing over here using the 220 grit emery paper. And it's going to start to, the top part is going to start to look pretty nice. Now, there are some marks here. I've got a little mark here. I've got a little dark mark here. So I've got some deep dents in here that I've got to remove. I know they're tough to see probably on that screen, but I do have some marks there that I need to sand out. So I'm going to continue to sand until I don't see any of those marks. Now, the outside of this doesn't look very smooth or clean, or I'm not even sanding that much at all. So here's where this little popsicle stick comes into play. I'm going to take this popsicle stick and I'm going to wrap the emery paper around it like this, and I'm going to fold it. Fold it over like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the edge here, putting as much pressure as I can on this. Ooh. Making the camera move. sanding all the way around, and you're going to start to see that that's going to start to get a little bit shinier and a little bit smoother. I'm going to start to sand around the edge now. All right. I do that all the way around that outside edge with this. Now, as I use this, you're going to see that it's going to rip. As it rips, I pull it up a little bit and then I fold it over. And now I got a fresher piece there so I can continue to sand around the edge. You do not need to sand the inside shape. This inside shape does not need to be sanded because we're going to put inlay in there, so don't bother with that. You're just going to sand the top and then around everything. Now, once I've sanded with 220 all the way around it, I'm going to now use 400. This is really not ready for 400, but I would do the same thing with 400. And I would sand the top of it, and it'll start to get smoother. All right. I still got some marks in there that I would have to get rid of with 220, especially around the outside. I could see some dark marks around the outside edge. I'm still not done with 220, but I would do the same thing when I'm finished with 220, and I'll tell you when to move on. You'll go ahead and work with 400 on the top the same way. Now, let's get to the back. The back, so we don't scratch up the front. I take a small piece of paper towel, really small piece, and I fold it up. And I make this little tiny bed for it. And I set this on there like that. Because if I put that on the table and I start sanding the back with 220, I'm going to scratch up what I've already done. Now here we can see a lot of pink stuff. That's fire scale. I got to sand all that away. And I can see some heavy scratches in here that I'm really going to need to get rid of. All right, but I'm starting to sand that the same way as I've sanded the other stuff. All right. Once I've sanded all this with 220 down to 400, then I'm ready for this steel wool. You'll get a small piece of this. I'll show you where to get that. And it's basically the same thing. You're going to take it and you're going to rub the top of it with this all the way around, and it'll start to really make it shiny. You can see it's really starting to reflect some light. At that point, we're ready to buff. Now again, this takes time. It takes quite a bit of time and some elbow grease, some work. So you got to make sure you work through all those scratches, get everything scratch free. Otherwise, when you go to buff, it's going to take you much, much longer, and it's going to be a lot more difficult to get a nice high luster on the metal. All right.